Imagine discovering that one of the most brutal and mysterious events in American slavery history was deliberately erased from every official record, hidden in the shadows of Louisiana's sugar plantations for over 180 years. In 1842, 11 people died in a single night, under circumstances so disturbing that authorities buried the truth deeper than the bodies in the swamp. The only connection: a silent African slave named Caleb Mbaku, whose past was as dark as the Louisiana bayou itself. Before we dive into this chilling tale of revenge, mystery, and forbidden justice, make sure to subscribe to the channel, hit that notification bell, and let me know in the comments where you're watching from. Now let's uncover the truth about the night that changed everything. The morning mist clung to the Mississippi River like a burial shroud when the slave ship Prosperity docked at New Orleans in March 1839. Among the cargo of human souls stood a figure that would haunt Belle Reve Plantation for years to come: Caleb Mbaku. Even the seasoned slave traders whispered about him during the 3-month voyage. He never spoke, never cried out during the beatings, never begged for water or food. His dark eyes held something that made grown men uncomfortable, a depth that suggested he was cataloging every face, every cruelty, every detail. "That one's trouble," muttered Captain Jeremiah Blackwood to the plantation overseer Thomas Whitmore. "Been watching him since we left the Gold Coast. He's different from the others." Whitmore spat tobacco juice into the muddy dock. "They all break eventually. The silent ones just take longer." But Caleb wasn't broken. As the iron shackles were removed from his wrists, revealing scars that formed intricate patterns, almost like ritual markings, he surveyed his new prison with the calculating gaze of a predator studying territory. The Belle Reve Plantation stretched across 3,000 acres of Louisiana's most fertile sugarland. Owned by the Beauregard family for 3 generations, it was known throughout the region for 2 things: exceptional sugar yields and exceptional cruelty toward its 200 enslaved workers. Master Henry Beauregard, a portly man with thinning hair and cruel eyes, examined his new property with the same attention he'd give to livestock. "Strong build," he noted, walking around Caleb. "Good teeth. Scars suggest he's a fighter, but that can be corrected." Caleb's eyes followed Beauregard's movements, but his expression remained stone cold. Inside his mind, however, memories flickered like flames in darkness. The burning village, his wife Amara's screams, his children's faces as the slavers dragged them away, the sacred ritual scars his father had carved into his flesh, marks that connected him to ancestors who had never known chains. "Put him in the cane fields," Beauregard ordered, "and make sure he understands the rules quickly." The overseer, Whitmore, was a man who took pleasure in breaking spirits. Standing 6 feet tall, with arms like tree trunks, he'd earned his reputation by turning rebellious slaves into obedient shadows of themselves. "You understand English, boy?" Whitmore growled, his breath reeking of whiskey and rotting teeth. Caleb said nothing. The first blow came swift and hard across his face, then another and another. Still, Caleb remained silent, his eyes never leaving Whitmore's face. Blood trickled from his split lip, but he didn't flinch. "Stubborn one, ain't you?" Whitmore chuckled. "We'll see how long that lasts." As Caleb was led to the slave quarters, a row of dilapidated wooden shacks that housed families in spaces smaller than horse stalls, other enslaved people watched with a mixture of curiosity and fear. "That one's got death in his eyes," whispered Sarah, an elderly woman who'd survived 30 years at Belle Reve. "I seen that look before. It don't end well for nobody." Young Marcus, barely 16 and born into bondage, helped Caleb find an empty corner in one of the overcrowded cabins. "Best keep your head down," Marcus advised quietly. "Master Beauregard, he got ways of making life worse than death. And Whitmore, he enjoys the breaking." Caleb finally spoke, his voice deep and accented with the rhythms of his homeland. Some things cannot be broken. That night, as exhausted bodies collapsed onto straw mattresses, Caleb sat in the darkness, his fingers tracing the ritual scars on his arms. In his mind, he could hear his father's voice from a lifetime ago. A warrior's strength comes not from his muscles, but from his patience. Watch, learn, remember, and when the time comes, strike like lightning from a clear sky. Outside, the Louisiana swamp whispered its ancient secrets, and somewhere in the distance, an owl called out like a warning. Caleb Mbaku had arrived at Belle Rive, and the countdown to November 15th, 1842, the night that would stain the plantation's history forever, had begun. 3 years passed like a slow-burning fever at Belle Rive plantation. Caleb Mbaku had become a ghost among the living, present but invisible, working but never truly seen. The other slaves had learned to read his silence like a language, understanding that behind those calculating eyes lay something far more dangerous than rebellion. It was Marcus who first noticed the patterns. "You see how he watches?" Marcus whispered to Sarah during their brief Sunday rest. "Not like he's planning to run, like he's studying." Sarah's weathered hands paused in their mending. At 63, she'd seen slaves come and go, witnessed uprisings crushed and spirits broken. But Caleb was different. "That man ain't planning to run nowhere," she said quietly. "He's planning something else entirely." What they didn't know was that Caleb had been mapping Belle Rive with the precision of a military strategist. Every guard rotation, every weak point in the fencing, every habit of the overseers. He knew that Whitmore drank himself unconscious every Tuesday night. He knew that Master Beauregard visited his mistress in New Orleans every third weekend. He knew which floorboards creaked in the main house and which windows were left unlocked. But most importantly, he knew about the ledger. Hidden in Master Beauregard's study was a leather-bound book that contained more than just plantation records. It held the names and locations of slave traders, the routes of ships, the prices paid for human cargo. And buried within those pages were clues about what had happened to his family. Caleb had learned to read English by watching the plantation's tutor teach the Beauregard children. Hidden in the shadows, he'd absorbed every lesson, every word, building a weapon more powerful than any blade. The opportunity came on a humid October evening in 1842. Master Beauregard was hosting a dinner party for neighboring plantation owners, a gathering of Louisiana's elite to discuss the growing tensions over slavery that was spreading from the north. The main house buzzed with activity as house slaves prepared elaborate meals and served expensive wine. Caleb, assigned to tend the horses of the visiting masters, moved through the shadows like smoke. The study window was open to catch the evening breeze. Inside, he could hear the muffled voices of the dinner party, the clink of glasses, the laughter of men who traded in human misery. With movements born of 3 years of careful observation, Caleb slipped through the window. The ledger sat on Beauregard's mahogany desk, its leather cover worn smooth by years of handling. Caleb's hands trembled, the first emotion he'd shown in years, as he opened to the entries from 1839. March 15th, 1839. Purchased 23 prime specimens from Captain Blackwood. Total cost, $18,400. Notable, one male, approximately 30 years, tribal markings, extremely resistant, separated from family unit, wife, 2 children, sold to Riverside Plantation, Mississippi. The words hit Caleb like physical blows. Amara, his children, alive, sold to Mississippi. But there was more. Note, subject shows signs of advanced intelligence. Recommend close monitoring. Captain Blackwood reports unusual behavior during voyage. Appeared to be memorizing ship details, guard rotations. Possible military background. Caleb's jaw clenched. They knew. They'd always known he was different, dangerous, and they'd deliberately separated him from his family to break his spirit. As he continued reading, copying crucial information into his memory with the precision of a trained scout, footsteps echoed in the hallway. Caleb closed the ledger and melted back into the shadows just as the study door opened. "Thought I heard something," muttered James Beauregard, Henry's eldest son and heir to the plantation. At 25, James had inherited his father's cruelty but lacked his cunning. James's eyes swept the room, lingering on the window. For a moment, Caleb thought he'd been discovered, but James, wine-addled and distracted, simply closed the window and returned to the party. Outside, hidden among the magnolia trees, Caleb processed what he'd learned. His family was alive, but more than that, he now understood the full scope of the network that had destroyed his life. Belle Reve wasn't just a plantation, it was a hub in a vast machine of human trafficking that stretched from Africa to the American South. The dinner party wasn't just social, it was a business meeting to coordinate the next shipment of stolen souls. As Caleb made his way back to the slave quarters, his mind was already working, planning, calculating. The silent African who had arrived 3 years ago was about to become something far more dangerous, a hunter, and his prey had no idea that their every move was being watched, catalogued, and remembered by someone who had nothing left to lose and everything to avenge. The other slaves noticed the change immediately. There was something different in Caleb's posture, a new intensity in his silence. Sarah caught his eye across the quarters and saw something that made her blood run cold. "Lord, have mercy," she whispered. "That man's about to bring down the wrath of God himself." She was closer to the truth than she knew. The Beauregard family had built their empire on blood and sugar, and by November 1842, that empire was about to face its reckoning. Henry Beauregard stood on the wraparound porch of his plantation mansion, surveying his domain with the satisfaction of a man who believed himself untouchable. At 58, he'd inherited Belle Reve from his father and expanded it into one of Louisiana's most profitable operations. What he hadn't inherited was his father's wisdom about treating human property with at least minimal care. "Father's getting worse," James Beauregard confided to his younger brother Charles, as they watched their father inspect the morning's work assignments. "Yesterday, he ordered 15 lashes for that field hand who looked at him wrong." Charles, 22 and fresh from his education in Charleston, shifted uncomfortably. Unlike his brother and father, he'd been exposed to the growing abolitionist sentiment in the cities. Not that he opposed slavery, the family fortune depended on it, but he understood that the winds were changing. "The other plantation owners are talking," Charles said quietly. "They say we're too harsh, that it draws unwanted attention." James laughed bitterly. "Since when do we care what others think? We produce more sugar per acre than any plantation in Louisiana. Our methods work." What neither brother knew was that their methods had created something far more dangerous than unwanted attention. They'd created Caleb M'Baku's burning desire for justice. That morning, as Caleb worked in the cane fields under the brutal November sun, he observed the family dynamics with the keen eye of a strategist. He'd learned to read the Beauregards like a book written in cruelty and greed. Henri was the patriarch, ruthless, paranoid, and increasingly unstable. His wife, Marie, had died 5 years earlier, some said from shame at her husband's excesses. James was the heir apparent, cruel but stupid, prone to drinking and making rash decisions. Charles was the weak link, educated enough to question but not brave enough to act. But it was the arrival of Henry's brother, Colonel Robert Beauregard, that changed everything. Robert had served in the Mexican-American War and returned to Louisiana with military precision and an even darker view of human nature than his brother. He'd come to Belle Reve to help modernize the operation, which meant implementing new forms of control and punishment. "These slaves are getting too comfortable," Robert announced during a family dinner that Caleb overheard while serving in the main house. "They need to be reminded of their place." "What do you suggest?" Henri asked, cutting into his roast beef with unnecessary violence. Public examples. Fear is the most effective motivator. Caleb's hands tightened imperceptibly on the serving tray as he refilled their wine glasses. In his peripheral vision, he caught Charles flinching at his uncle's words. "There's one in particular," Robert continued, "that silent African, the one who never speaks. He's been here 3 years, and I've been watching him. He's too calm, too observant. He's planning something." Henri's fork paused midway to his mouth. "Caleb, he's harmless, broken. No man is broken who still has that look in his eyes. I've seen it in enemy soldiers right before they attack. He's dangerous." James leaned forward, interested. "What do you recommend?" "Make an example of him, public whipping. Show the others what happens to slaves who think too much." Caleb continued serving as if he hadn't heard, but inside his mind was racing. They suspected him. His careful facade of submission was beginning to crack. That night in the slave quarters, word spread quickly about the planned punishment. Sarah found Caleb sitting alone, staring into the darkness. "They coming for you tomorrow," she whispered. "Colonel Robert, he got it in his head that you're trouble." Caleb's voice was barely audible. "He's right. You got to run. Tonight. Before they..." "No." Caleb's tone was final. "Running solves nothing. My family is still in chains. Other families are still being torn apart. Running only delays the inevitable." Marcus appeared beside them, his young face tight with worry. "Then what you gonna do?" For the first time in 3 years, Caleb smiled. It was not a pleasant expression. "I'm going to give them exactly what they expect," he said. "A broken slave who knows his place." But as he spoke, his fingers traced the ritual scars on his arms, scars that told the story of a warrior's initiation, of sacred oaths sworn to ancestors who had never bowed to any master. The next morning, Colonel Robert personally supervised Caleb's punishment. 50 lashes with a cat-o'-nine tails, delivered in front of the assembled slaves as a lesson in obedience. Caleb took each blow without a sound, his eyes fixed on some distant point beyond the pain. But those who knew him well, Sarah, Marcus, a few others, saw something else in his expression. Calculation. Each crack of the whip was being added to a ledger of debts that would soon come due. When it was over, Caleb collapsed to his knees, blood streaming down his back. The other slaves were dismissed to their work, but Colonel Robert lingered. "Remember this, boy," he said, leaning close to Caleb's ear. "This is what happens to slaves who forget their place. Next time, it'll be worse." Caleb raised his head slowly, meeting the colonel's eyes with a gaze that made the military man take an involuntary step backward. "Yes, master," Caleb whispered. "I understand perfectly." But what Colonel Robert didn't understand was that he'd just made the final entry in his own death warrant. November 15th was exactly 2 weeks away. The whipping had been a mistake. Colonel Robert Beauregard realized this 3 days later when he noticed that the plantation's atmosphere had changed in ways he couldn't quite define. The slaves still worked. They still obeyed orders. But there was something different in their movements, a subtle coordination that hadn't existed before. Conversations stopped when overseers approached. Eyes met and held for just a moment too long. Messages seemed to pass without words. "Something's happening," Robert told his brother Henri as they stood on the mansion's porch, watching the evening work crews return from the fields. "The slaves are different." Henri waved dismissively. "You're imagining things. The whipping worked. They're more obedient than ever." But Robert's military instincts were screaming warnings. He'd seen this before. The calm before an attack, when enemy forces moved with purpose beneath a veneer of normalcy. What he didn't know was that Caleb Mbaku had spent 3 years building something unprecedented in the history of American slavery, a network. It had started small, a word here, a gesture there. Caleb had identified the natural leaders among the enslaved population, not the obvious ones who drew attention, but the quiet influences, the ones others turned to in times of trouble. Sarah, the elderly woman whose wisdom commanded respect across generational lines. Marcus, young but brave, with connections to slaves on neighboring plantations through his work delivering messages. Big Tom, the blacksmith whose forge gave him access to tools and whose strength made him invaluable. Lily, the house slave who could move through the main house invisible and unnoticed. One by one, Caleb had approached them, not with grand speeches about freedom. That would have been suicide. Instead, he'd offered something more practical: information. Master Beauregard, planning to sell 3 families next month, he'd whispered to Sarah one evening, heard him talking to the slave trader. The information proved accurate. Sarah had been able to warn the families, who used the advance notice to hide small valuables and prepare their children for separation. Gradually, Caleb became a source of crucial intelligence. He knew when punishments were coming, when work assignments would change, when visitors would arrive. His ability to move unseen and his growing understanding of English made him invaluable to the survival of the slave community. But information flowed both ways. Through his network, Caleb learned about the broader world beyond Belle Reve. Marcus brought news from other plantations. Lily overheard conversations about politics and business. Big Tom had contact with free blacks in New Orleans who carried news from the north. By November 1842, Caleb knew that the country was moving toward a crisis over slavery. He knew that there were people in the north working to end the institution. He knew that some slaves had successfully escaped to freedom. But most importantly, he knew that his family was still alive. Marcus had made contact with a slave from Riverside Plantation in Mississippi. The news was both heartbreaking and hopeful. Amara was alive, but sick from overwork. His son, now 13, was being trained as a field hand. His daughter, 11, worked in the main house. They remembered him. They were waiting. This knowledge had transformed Caleb's careful planning from a desire for personal revenge into something larger, a systematic dismantling of the network that had destroyed his family and continued to destroy others. The ledger he discovered in Beauregard's study had revealed the full scope of the operation. Belle Reve wasn't just a plantation. It was a central hub in a trafficking network that stretched from New Orleans to Charleston, from the African coast to the cotton fields of Georgia. Captain Blackwood, the slave ship captain, made regular stops at Belle Reve. Thomas Whitmore, the overseer, had connections to slave catchers who hunted runaways. The Beauregard family maintained business relationships with plantation owners across the South, coordinating purchases and sales of human beings like livestock. But networks, Caleb had learned, were vulnerable. Remove the right connections, and the entire system could collapse. The plan that had been forming in his mind for months was not just about killing his tormentors. It was about sending a message that would reverberate throughout the slave-holding South. Some people could not be broken, and some crimes demanded a reckoning that transcended law and custom. On November 10th, 5 days before the night that would change everything, Caleb made his final preparations. He met with each member of his network individually, giving them specific instructions for November 15th. Some would create alibis. Others would ensure that certain doors remained unlocked, certain guards would be distracted, certain evidence would disappear. "You sure about this?" Sarah asked when he came to her. "Once this starts, there ain't no going back." Caleb's scarred hands were steady as he spoke. "My ancestors are calling for justice. The spirits of every man, woman, and child sold into bondage are demanding an accounting. I am simply the instrument of their will." Sarah studied his face in the dim light of the cabin. What she saw there was not madness, but a terrible clarity of purpose. "Then may God have mercy on us all," she whispered. Outside, the Louisiana swamp whispered its ancient secrets, and somewhere in the darkness, an owl called out like a warning that no one heeded. November 15th, 1842, dawned gray and oppressive, with storm clouds gathering over the Louisiana bayou like harbingers of the violence to come. The air hung thick with humidity and an electric tension that made both animals and humans restless. Caleb Mabaku moved through his morning routine with the same methodical precision he'd maintained for 3 years, but today every action carried the weight of finality. As he worked in the cane fields, his mind reviewed the plan one last time, checking each detail like a general before battle. The timing had to be perfect. At 6 p.m., the field slaves would return to their quarters for the evening meal. At 7 p.m., the house slaves would serve dinner to the Beauregard family and their guests. Colonel Robert had invited several neighboring plantation owners to discuss security measures in light of growing abolitionist activity. At 8 p.m., Thomas Whitmore would begin his evening rounds, checking the slave quarters and perimeter guards. At 9 p.m., he would retire to his cabin with a bottle of whiskey, as he did every night. At 10 p.m., when the main house settled into its nightly routine and the guards grew complacent, Caleb would begin his work. But first, there was one final piece of business to attend to. During the lunch break, Caleb approached Big Tom at the blacksmith forge. The massive man was repairing a broken plow, his powerful arms working the bellows with practiced ease. "It's time," Caleb said simply. Tom nodded without looking up from his work. Over the past weeks, he'd been crafting special items for this night. Tools that would serve purposes far removed from their intended agricultural use. "Everything's ready," Tom murmured. "Hidden where you said." As evening approached, the plantation took on an almost festive atmosphere. The main house blazed with light as the Beauregard family entertained their guests. Laughter and conversation drifted across the grounds, mixing with the sounds of slaves preparing for another night of exhausted sleep. But beneath the surface normalcy, Caleb's network moved with silent purpose. Lily, serving wine in the main house, noted which guests were drinking heavily and which remained alert. Marcus, tending to the visitors' horses, ensured that certain saddles were loosened and certain bridles were subtly damaged. Sarah, preparing the evening meal in the slave quarters, distributed small vials of a bitter herb that would cause violent stomach cramps, insurance that certain slaves would have unshakable alibis for the night's events. At 9:47 p.m., Caleb made his move. The first target was Thomas Whitmore. The overseer's cabin sat isolated at the edge of the plantation, close enough to the slave quarters to maintain control, but far enough from the main house to muffle any sounds. Whitmore was exactly where Caleb expected him to be, slumped in his chair, a half-empty bottle of whiskey on the table beside him. Caleb entered through the unlocked back door, moving like a shadow across the rough wooden floor. Whitmore's eyes opened just as Caleb's hand closed around his throat. "Remember me?" Caleb whispered, his voice carrying the weight of 3 years of silent rage. Whitmore's eyes widened in recognition and terror. He tried to speak, to scream, but Caleb's grip was iron-strong and precisely placed to cut off both air and sound. "You broke my body," Caleb continued, his voice barely audible, "but you could not break my spirit. Tonight, you pay for every lash, every humiliation, every moment of pain you inflicted on my people." The overseer's death was swift, but not merciful. When it was over, Caleb arranged the body to look like Whitmore had simply drunk himself to death, a not uncommon occurrence among plantation overseers. The second target was Captain Jeremiah Blackwood. The slave ship captain was staying in the main house as a guest of the Beauregards, sleeping off a dinner heavy with rich food and expensive wine. Caleb entered through the servants' stairs, using passages that Lily had mapped for him over months of careful observation. Blackwood's room was on the second floor, overlooking the plantation grounds. The captain lay sprawled across the bed, snoring loudly, his clothes reeking of tobacco and rum. Caleb stood over the man who had torn him from his homeland, who had chained him in the belly of a ship like cargo, who had sold his family like livestock. "You stole my life," Caleb whispered. "Now I take yours." This death was more elaborate. Caleb used techniques learned from his father, a warrior who had fought slave raiders for decades before finally being overwhelmed. When morning came, it would appear that Blackwood had suffered a heart attack, brought on perhaps by his excessive lifestyle. But Caleb was just getting started. The third target was James Beauregard. Henri's eldest son was in his study, reviewing plantation accounts and drinking brandy. Unlike the others, James was alert, suspicious. The evening's conversation had centered on rumors of slave unrest, and he'd volunteered to stay up late, keeping watch. This required a different approach. Caleb entered through the study window, the same one he'd used months earlier to read the ledger. But this time, James was waiting. "I knew it," the young master said, rising from his chair with a pistol in his hand. "I knew you were planning something." Caleb stood perfectly still, his hands visible, his expression calm. "Yes, master. You were right." "You're going to hang for this," James snarled. "But first, you're going to tell me who else is involved." Caleb smiled, the same cold expression that had unnerved the slave traders years earlier. "No one else," he said. "This is my work alone." James's finger tightened on the trigger, but he never got the chance to fire. Caleb moved with the fluid grace of a predator, crossing the room in 3 swift strides. The pistol discharged harmlessly into the ceiling as the two men struggled, but this was no contest. Caleb had been preparing for this moment for 3 years, his body hardened by labor and his mind sharpened by purpose. James Beauregard, soft from privilege and slowed by alcohol, never had a chance. When it was over, Caleb arranged the scene carefully, a struggle, a robbery gone wrong, the kind of random violence that plagued isolated plantations. 4 down, 7 to go. The night was far from over. The main house of Belle Reve Plantation had become a tomb, though its remaining occupants didn't yet know it. As midnight approached, Caleb Mabaku moved through the corridors like death itself, methodical and unstoppable. Colonel Robert Beauregard was the 4th to die. The military man's instincts had kept him partially awake, his subconscious mind registering the subtle wrongness that had settled over the plantation.